today, and we wish you a very fruitful event. Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event. Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event. Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event. Welcome to Our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of world heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views Welcome to Our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of world heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all the audience in this panel. This is the 18th session of our new approaches to heritage as part of our World Heritage sessions. Welcome everybody. Today we have three panelists who will be discussing heritage of the marginalized. Official heritage of national states often give priority to the ideal of national inclusive citizenship and responsibilities and duties as defined by leaders, laws, constitutions, and various political regimes. In former colonial countries, the post-colonial states of today, heritage is also recruited to emphasize the struggle for national liberation, national heroes, usually male, and the benefits of being free from colonial powers. In these contexts, post-colonial, otherwise, the nation is emphasized over the differences and the multiple histories in terms of such aspects as gender, race, class, ethnicity, or indigeneity. Sometimes the marginalized contributions to culture and heritage, such as from women, are acknowledged in passing, in exhibitions, for example, sometimes cultural performances, and in the arts and the sciences. More often, the history and culture associated with women and those of other marginalized groups are erased or not fully recognized. These include those that are divided or segmented and discriminated against by race, ethnicity, religion, indigenous peoples, the poor, the migrants, lesbians, gays, and other genders, the youth, aged, the mentally, physically, and medically disabled. Oftentimes, these marginal groups are written out of history, considered less than human, of no importance, and deserve no mention or valorization in terms of heritage. Other times, they are minimally acknowledged for their crafts, but are disregarded for the skill and the penetrating art of performances that are disruptive and a commentary on societal needs, desires, and wants. In some contexts, they have been given full recognition, but experts are their voices rather than themselves. On other occasions, recognition is offered when they themselves, as a community, organize themselves and demand such recognition for their festivals, their arts and crafts, their languages, their cultures and history. Sometimes they simply have to make their own heritage, their own festivals, exhibitions, performances for themselves. Yet all these struggles for recognition and valorization are that of heritage of the marginalized. In this session of the new approaches to heritage, we focus on those that have been marginalized from official heritage narratives and that have struggled and striven for recognition and acknowledgement of their heritage. Today we have three speakers: Guarnacci, Toki Brown, and Tsitsina, Xavante, who will be talking on various aspects of what I have just mentioned. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Ugo to make his presentation, which is going to be along the lines of looking at the question of risk, which in most cases seems to be associated with disaster and conflict. He's going to offer a different view on this. Ugo.
Thanks a lot, Shahid, and thanks a lot to everyone, the organizer, for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. Let me start by sharing my screen before I actually move into my presentation. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Good. So I'm Ugo Guarnacci, and I'm here in my capacity as a visiting fellow at the School of Politics, Economics, and International Relations of the University of Reading. I also wear another hat because I'm project advisor at the European Commission, the Executive Agency for Research. But today here, I'm more like to present to you part of what was my PhD research some years ago, which I think is still quite relevant in the debate of heritage at risk. And I will focus on the issue of what is gender-sensitive approaches to disaster and conflict management, looking at Indonesia. So in this journey that I'll try to do with you for this presentation, I'll start by presenting the aims of this paper, moving to a case study approach, because of course Indonesia is a huge country, and I'll focus on Aceh and Nias, which have been affected by the December 2004 tsunami, and Aceh also by 30 years of conflict. I'll dig into the distinction, which is quite relevant in economics. My PhD was in economics between formal and informal institution, discuss some main result and try to draw some conclusion. Of course, we have always this idea that an economic perspective on heritage might rely upon just economic theory or economic models, but this paper actually embraces the broader approach of economic analysis, which of course harvests also from other disciplines within social sciences, such as, in my case, economic geography, anthropology, and of course, sociology. The main first aim of this paper is then to challenge the notion that heritage at risk is often associated mainly with the protection of the most iconic heritage sites in regions that are prone to conflict and disaster. Of course, this framework is still very valid and important, but what I try to question here is that we should enlarge this definition of heritage at risk, also including the intangible part, not in generic terms, but actually looking at the identities, both individually and collective, of people affected by the disaster by making what economists call the natural experiment before and after a crisis. Therefore, in order to do so, I'll combine in this paper, in this presentation, a political economy with a cultural economy approach, which actually harvests the research on social capital, which is called capital because it implies two kinds of investment in time and investment in trust that are needed in order to create bonding ties with family, clan, and communities. And last but not least, I'll try to dig into the solid institutional economic analysis, start from North and the new institutionalism economics that draw this distinction between institution and organization, where institution are, of course, the rules of the play, and organization are made of individuals and therefore are the players of the game, and between formal and informal institutions, where formal institutions are those legally binding rules, while informal institutions are actually socially binding. So in order to use, let's say, the Durkheim definition, in a contract between two parties, not everything is contractual, but still equally important in the analysis. I want to clarify, just to avoid self-plagiarism, that this presentation relies on two other papers published on a similar topic, one on the social network analysis of community resilience in post-disaster, post-conflict Indonesia, published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and another one on the assessment of sustainable reconstruction after the disaster in Indonesia, published on the Environmental Development Journal. So if we dig into the two case studies I'm presenting, I'd like to highlight that those data are primary data collected through survey and in-depth interviews during two fieldworks in Indonesia, first one in 2009, second one in 2011. And although 10 years have passed in that fieldwork, I think those two case studies are still iconic because they actually ring a bell on what is heritage at risk and what is the intangible component of that heritage at risk, in particular because disaster and conflict are unfortunately happening still today. And the way we manage and we look at gender sensitive in that respect has been evolved since the concept was introduced into the Sindai framework for DRR in 2015. So Aceh and Nias are both affected by the December 2004 tsunami, which was a massive disaster in terms of death and area affected, but they're different. Aceh is actually a province in the northern part of Indonesia, while Nias is a small island in the province of North Sumatra. Although the majority of people in Aceh to work in the agriculture sector, Aceh has a strong oil and gas economy base, while Nias is more on the semi-subsistence economy. Aceh has been experiencing three decades of, so 30 years of conflict between the GAM, the Free Aceh movement, and the central government in Indonesia. And the conflict actually stopped, finished in 2005, in order to allow the donors to actually distribute aid related to the tsunami. While in Nias, there were not any major serious political turmoil. And Aceh has the biggest portion of Muslim in the country with regional level of Sharia law, while 90% of the population in Nias Island are Christian. So there is, as you can see in my paper, there will be this intersectionality between gender, ethnicity, and religion as the three main informal social norms I'm going to consider during this presentation. If we look at Nias, you will see that when the disaster happened, the heritage at risk was considered mainly in terms of the Omohada, which are the traditional house of Nias, and also the wooden ancestor statues that are called the Adudzata, because Nias is known historically for the megalithic structure and store carvings, and therefore there is also a museum that is managed by the Protestant Christian Church that has been devoting lots of funding from the Caritas in Borga to the management of this traditional house, which of course are not all in a good state and have been also maintained by using materials that are not the kind of timber that they were made of originally. But when you look at the informal institutions, social norms, and therefore the intangible part of the heritage in Nias, you will see that the patriarchy is still strongly present in the island, with men ruling women, as the local population was described, the patriarchal society, and which actually result into the fact that there is a bride wealth that is paid from the husband towards the uncle of the bride, with the bride also completely excluded by the inheritance system. There is a strongly gender division of labor, with women taking care of the strong part of the caring within the household, but also in terms of cacao and rubber production and pig farming in the Christian community, of course, not in the Muslim one. But when you look at ethnicity and the way gender is interacting with ethnicity, you will see the pattern, which is the Muslim part of the women that come from that region in Indonesia, and the Chinese, so these are the migrant communities. Those women are also the one much more involved in small, actually, businesses and restaurants present on the island. And when you look at religion as another element of intersectionality, you will see that actually Muslim women are considered being completely isolated from the rest of the women organization that deal with also community life within Nias Island. If you look at Aceh, there the heritage at risk was mainly represented by the iconic building that you will find in Banda Aceh, the capital city of the region, which was and is the Baitur Rahman Mosque. Indeed, Banda Aceh, the capital city, is called Port of Mecca, because pilgrims that traveled by sea from Indonesia would definitely make a stopover in the city. And the characteristic, iconic characteristic of the mosque is that it remained there, although being slightly affected by the tsunami, but it remained solid. And therefore it stands as a testament to survival and reconstruction. And there are lots of pictures about before and after the mosque, the way it has been affected, also the surrounding, in the newly created museum for tsunami in Aceh. Aceh is completely different in terms of informal institution and intangible heritage compared to Nias, because here we have matrifocality and uxorilocal dwelling, which means that the women are at the center of the household, in particular all elderly women, and the uxorilocal dwelling implies that the husband will actually move to the house and the village of the bride. The bride receives also part of the bride price, and actually has also right to the inheritance, both of land of the house, which is another big difference. Gender and ethnicity are very interconnected in Aceh, because Aceh's women feel proudly to be Achenese, which make a complete distinction with the Javanese womanhood and motherhood. Why? Because Achenese women were the ones staying at home when their husbands, sons, and all the male community from their own village went in the rural part of the region to fight against the militaries from the central Javanese government. And unfortunately, those Achenese women were also the one victims of violence and rape from the Javanese central government military forces. And there is another level of course, intersectionality when it comes to occupation, because in the job market, unfortunately, Chinese women are idly starting participating in the public administration around the jobs created for the gender-sensitive planning, disaster risk reduction, or still actually dealing with more agriculture, subsistence occupation. Let me just zoom in this last part for the last 4 minutes of my presentation on the key result. Although gender-sensitive disaster risk reduction and conflict management were embraced by the newly created National Disaster Agency in Indonesia, this was not actually reflected in the informal institutions that are present both in Aceh and Nias. Why? Because gender-sensitive actions imply at least making time and space for participation. When it comes to women, the in-depth interview I had across the different villages, both urban and rural, were actually instrumental in pointing out that women do not often have time to participate in these co-creation activities around gender-sensitive DRR and conflict management, because they already need to take care about the household's caring activities and the one related to the agricultural occupation and fetching water. And also the space is important, because often the space chosen for this kind of participatory approaches is the place where the NGOs or the donor headquarters are, which means commuting and actually asking their men to give them a lift to go there. And therefore, this is another obstacle for participation. We need to also understand the conflict between gender as a word that has been framed and defined by gender studies that often have a strong Western tradition, go in conflict with religious prospects. And this is very common, because all the ulama and the priests that I interviewed, they were all saying that disaster are act of God, and all the women and men have actually their own role in society according to what is naturally attributed to them. And so it is a contradiction, if you want, if you allow me to say so, that the gender-sensitive action in terms of DRR and conflict management in Aceh were actually given as a management system to the DIA educational system, which is the Islam Sharia-based boarding school, which were completely against the concept of gender as we define it within gender studies. And also the two offices, the Family Welfare Organization, PKK, that existed even before the disaster, but also the newly created Women Empowerment and Childhood Protection, you see, they all are structured around the idea of women as mother and as wife. We should also consider that there is a gap between working on gender and understanding how gender works, which means that often we consider those issues about gender sensitive just in terms of, let's ask women too, which we are assuming that women by simplistic logic are all allies, but it's not the case. Often the women that were asked their opinion were much more closer to the opinion shared by the men of their household and team than by other women in the village. And so we should also avoid this assumption that donor organization and NGO will embrace completely the gender parity within the organization, because often we found actually an uneven distribution of power within those organizations promoting gender sensitive planning. And my last point is, of course, that gender dynamics is not just about binary men and women. Also implies giving voices to the internally displaced person, that in Indonesia were people moving within villages affected by the tsunami and the conflict, and in particular in that category, the youth, who remain unemployed, and of course the LGBTI community, and in particular the transgender. The varia is a term used in Indonesia to actually express male femininity. So there are those who are biologically male but adopt a distinct feminine feature and identity. They've been completely excluded from the disaster risk reduction debate and from what is actually considered at risk in terms also of identity. So to conclude my last slide, I would like to focus on some key points. First and foremost, tsunami and conflict in Indonesia created a completely transformation of the social network of the communities, because they killed thousands of people, and therefore they reduce the sense of communities and they're awakening the collective identity. And so this is part of the intangible heritage that has been highly affected, and they should have been incorporated in the debate around heritage at risk. When we promote gender-sensitive action, we should not just remain at the level of formal institution, because what is actually contrasting those actions that are gender-sensitive are the informal institutions, which are actually culturally derived and therefore tenacious, with a strong tenacious survival ability. There was a lack of sense-making in Indonesia about what is gender-sensitive and how can we work on the culture cognitive element of this institution that are framed around gender, religion, and ethnicity. And we should not forget that gender is a marker of difference and therefore is not natural. There is no natural disaster. There is a natural risk, but actually gender, like disaster and conflict, are a social production. And last but not least, gender implies going beyond the binary logic, embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and therefore including other marginalized voices. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. Sorry, Shahid, you're muted.
Speaking without. Thank you. Thank you for alerting me. Thank you very much for that presentation. This is very interesting for me, who has to deal with a number of these kinds of issues almost daily. The relationship between the formality and the norms and values of local people, which are not always incorporated into various forms of policy and legislation. And the rational argument is that the laws, the policies, and the legislation must be applied regardless of what may exist on the ground. And therein lies a whole host of problems, which can complicate matters rather than resolve. And then it piles on the issues of what do we mean, as you say, by gender sensitive, and how do we get beyond the kind of binaries that are implied in the more formal aspects. But we can come back to this in a short while, and we can move forward to Tokie's round's talk today, which is going to deal with whether it's possible for the recognition of marginalized heritage in an African perspective, and in particular, how socially responsive, coming from an African background with ethics embedded pretty much the same way as I'm assuming the way Ugo has expressed it, and how that might influence the way in which we begin to understand the marginalized voices and allowing them a platform or a voice within the context of heritage. Thank you. Toki, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm on site at the moment, so you're going to be hearing noise from my background. I do apologize for that. My name is Dr. Toki Lauter Brown, and I have a Doctor of Science in Economics, like Ugo, so I do have economics and conservation for architectural and environmental heritage. And what I will be talking about, if somebody could please help me with my presentation, but I would just keep going from there. My title is I Am Because You Are, which is the Ubuntu philosophy. And we have an African saying which says that we do not flow far away from the stream, right? So in the human mind, it requires a usable past because of our inheritance. And what is our inheritance? Our memories. And this is a key to self-identification, a way for us to comprehend our place in the stream of time. And this was why I used that as the title for this presentation. And it gives us a sense of our long story on this planet. So as an African, I am because we are. This is part of our African heritage oikos, defined as recreated time, which responds to constantly modified physical, social, psychological contexts. We have to always include land, which is not reducible to just our household, but rather it includes the circularity of natural laws, water, soil, air, and fire. These are all the elements, right? As an art of humanity and part of our communal values. So for one to feel marginalized within heritage, it has to have a sense that, we have to have this sense that our history, our culture does not belong or is not valued within the wider community. Such feelings can emerge whenever something is named or selected as heritage. So I will use, for example, OUV, outstanding universal value. There's so much going on in that. So why not our universal value? Why does it have to be outstanding? Because when you create this kind of categorizations, then people tend to move away from something that is traditionally theirs, which is what we're seeing in Africa, where we have people looking for something that looks more Western to put on the heritage list, as opposed to what they, the community, want to put forward. And so this type of interpretation processes of heritage making can incorporate some understanding or meaning and perceptions of a particular group, right? Nevertheless, they marginalize, ignore, or disinherit others. It is argued that the emerging heritage literature recognizes the contested nature of heritage, right? And the role of power in the construction of history and the production of identity. So as an African, it is not possible to divorce the things identified and celebrated today as cultural heritage from colonial and imperial histories and the experiences of the subaltern populations. So what do? It is not uncommon that different groups are excluded or marginalized. The heritage, culture, and identity of marginalized groups illustrates how local history and global history can be linked in ways that enact personal and collective lives. These histories can relegate marginalized heritages towards the edge of societal validation and away from the core of place narratives. So marginalized heritages is thus a process, it's not a label, a means of social devaluation that serves to justify disproportionately access to affirmation within a dominant politically and economically placed heritage. And I just hope that my PowerPoint presentation will come up now so I can take it from there. So if Monica can help me put the presentation up.
Just a moment, please. I'm sorry.
No problem, thank you. So part of all of this is, how do we bring marginalized heritage into mainstream? Why do we continue to categorize in such ways that limit accessibility and participation? So if we're talking about living heritage and we're talking about African heritage, thank you very much. When we're talking about this within this context, we're looking at the suitability of place-based and values-based heritage systems, right? So again, we go back to identification, documentation, and assessment. And how do we do that? Because most times when we're doing all of this, we seem to focus more on the tangible elements and forget that it's the intangible that makes the tangible. It has become our universal value because of what happened within that tangible. So the place of human and cultural rights how diversity can be incorporated into the mainstream heritage policies and practices, and envisioning a heritage futures approach, which is inclusive of everybody. So I usually say that when we sit at a table, because there's such a thing as social responsibility. So when we're at a table, we have to look around and say, who is not here? Based on gender, based on race, based on age, based on who is not here. And we begin to incorporate everybody as gate openers, because whoever is at the table is in a possible position to open the gate and bring people in. Because the whole reason why we even have the marginalized in the first place is because of accessibility. And so we see the current trends now, where we have civil society activism, growing policy concerns, and the SDGs playing active roles with Goal 10, and everyone calling for inclusive, responsible prosperity to better manage marginalization. But again, it comes back to us as individuals. Are we opening the doors? Are we looking around? Are we making sure that one of us is not there? And again, I will go back. However far the stream flows, it never forgets the source. There is a reason for that. No matter where we go, because right now we're talking about climate change. Everyone's talking about climate change. And we are going back to the ways of the old. We're learning to look back and say, okay, how do we solve this problem? That means we're going back to our source. And the same goes for heritage, because it is inheritance that we're passing down to the next generation. If we continue to marginalize people and keep them on the periphery of what's going on, again, we lose those voices. And again, we're passing the same methods to the next generation, meaning we haven't learned anything. Next slide, please. So recommendations. Having worked in Africa and looking at how we put properties up, on the tentative list, what we see more and more is what is Eurocentric, what will be accepted, right? That is what governments tend to look at. My issue is the communities need to be part of how the tentative list is worked out. So to enable local communities benefit as much as possible from the social and economic spin-offs from their own cultural heritages, to promote actions within African communities for sustainable development and strengthen the capacity for civil society organizations, which include the media. Of course, social media and media outlets have a role to play. To allow for active participation in the sustainable protection of heritage in Africa by Africans for Africans. To enable access to funding that does not impose international experts as a criteria to oversee what has been traditionally a custodian initiative. Next slide, please. I think that should be the last one. Yes. And so I will end with this. I'm half Yoruba, I'm half Edo from the western part of Nigeria. So Edo is the Benin side. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Benin bronzes. So half of my heritage is that, and the other heritage is Yoruba. And so from the Yoruba perspective, the community exists for the primary purpose of advancing the well-being of its members. And Augustine Schutter describes this African community using the peculiar African description of the family below. The family has no function outside of itself. So if we see ourselves within heritage as a family, it is a means of growth for its members, every member. The interaction, the companionship, and the conversation between the growing and fully grown members, so we're talking about every aspect of the family members, is an end in itself. Because of this, no one is a stranger. The world is our common home. The earth is the property of all. Because human life only exists by being shared. All that is necessary for that life, for the living and the living well, is shared by the family as a whole. Thank you. Oops. Please.
Shahid, you are muted. Shahid?
There we go. I'm unmuted now. Thank you, Toki, for your talk. It certainly resonates with some of the work that I'm doing. I'm especially interested that you started off with outstanding universal value. That's an important point. It's one that is embedded in the Venice Declaration, and it is extremely Eurocentric. And so I'm glad you've brought that up, because it requires concentrated attention to what you are raising as why is it that and not any other form of outstanding cultural value, architectural value, whatever is expressed as part of heritage. I would also like to just raise some of the, or bring to your attention some of the issues that you've raised. You've talked about the SDGs 11, but I think there is in one of the SDGs, it also refers to culture, and I was wondering whether at some point you might want to see how the various SDGs relate to heritage. You did mention how we need to return to the sources and what we draw from that into the present. Some of these sources in itself might reveal marginalization in different forms, and one needs to be able to address that. And I like the idea of your reference to the African family. My understanding, of course, is that, especially in West Africa, the African family is not a family as simply understood in a Eurocentric way, which is the mother, father, and siblings, but is a much broader concept, and it relates in part to what my experiences in West Africa have been, the notion of a compound where multiple families live together, and that this is the African family, and how this plays out in the context of heritage. But let's leave that aside for a moment, and we can come back to it later. Monica, do we know if Tsitsina is available? Or
yes, she is with us.
Oh, she's with us. Well, okay. So Tsitsina is going to be talking about the challenges, the advances that Indigenous women in Brazil have made, and how some of their voices have now reached into the decision-making processes. Again, here we return, I guess, to the relationship between the informal and the formal. So if Tsitsina wants to go ahead, please do.
Olá, boa tarde. Obrigada, Shahid. Não sei se eu pronuncio.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Shahid. I don't know if I am pronouncing correctly. Thank you for doing this mediation with us. And before starting my speech, I'd like to say first that both the presentation of Hugo and Toki, it's important as a woman from the originary people in Brazil. It's very important for me to understand, to know these different realities regarding heritage. In the case of Brazil, I'll talk about the diversity of women from the originary peoples. And before talking about indigenous heritage, I'd like to say a little bit about this diversity of women and of originary peoples in Brazil. In Brazil, we have a population of about 900,000 indigenous people, according to the last data of the Geographic Institute of Brazil, the IBGE, who conduct the census in Brazil. So this dates back to 2010. We had about 900,000 indigenous people. in Brazil, inhabitants in Brazil, and out of them, 57% lives in indigenous land. So, but still we have 43% living in urban areas. Regarding the gender issues, there is a balance in the population pyramids. Regarding age range, the youth population is much expressive than the old and adult generations. And speaking about the diversity aspect in Brazil, and talking also about heritage, I want to speak briefly about the history of the indigenous women in Brazil. Since we have records, when we talk about indigenous movements, and not only indigenous, but a series of social movements, the first things that come to mind is something organized, searching for something. And so the very indigenous movement in Brazil is always in search to advocate our rights as indigenous peoples, totally interconnected with the very indigenous heritage. Because for us, originary peoples, this term heritage sometimes end up by being too technical, because for us, our territory is our very essence. It's where we are at while indigenous peoples, either in the traditional land or for those that live in an urban area. This many times means living in the cities, and also they have a need to go back to their traditional land to search for their very essence of the indigenous being. So we don't use this word so much, but the very culture is heritage, and our culture is dynamics, is not static. It is in constant transformation, and the heritage is our life itself as peoples and communities. The heritage is our expression of our cultures that are at the base and give meaning and sense to our identity, both as individual and collectively. So both in our land and in our communities, and also in the city. Being in the city doesn't mean that we are less in natives, and this is an issue that great part of the Brazilian society express prejudice and racism. There is this imagination that in great part of the Brazilian society of indigenous people, a vision of the past that goes back to 500 years at the time of the Brazilian colonization. So our essence is our land, but being in the city, we also live collectively. So we also have our own heritage in this way. And regarding now talking about diversities and in relation to women natives, when we speak about organized indigenous movements in Brazil since the 1980s, when there was started the first mobilizations and articulations of the indigenous movement in Brazil, searching for their rights, it is known in Brazil as of the movement for the constituent. And from the 1988 constitution, after the military dictatorship, there was an acknowledgement of this by the state, acknowledging our cultural identity and our ethnic diversity that started based on this organized movement. But when we speak about movements, if you go searching for archive images or visual images, the majorities are men, and also with decision-making visibility. What has changed since the 1980s until today, in 2021, is that from that time up to now, the indigenous women engaged in the movement and also in this search, not only to participate in the hearing, participate in the observing, that is also a participation, but also reaching a point when, as I said, out of each, inside each woman, the voice could come out and echo, not only to the indigenous population, but also to the non-indigenous populations. So since then, from then on, we have had series of organizations, collectives, networks of indigenous women. We already have indigenous women as council women in the municipality chambers that are political people in the realm of the municipalities. We have chiefs or cacique in Portuguese, women, also the shaman, indigenous women. In last election in Brazil, we had the first indigenous women as a congresswoman, the first one to occupy a place in the National Congress. It was in the 1980s, and he was Mário Juruna. And then after 30 years, another indigenous person entered the Congress of Brazil, and she was a woman, Napshana. But besides this context, we have professionals, indigenous women, professors, physicians, craftsmen, craftswomen. So there is participation in the political and decision-making realm, but there is also a need for us to verify that this visibility needed to have the indigenous to have, giving the visibility of their abilities and competencies in adversity. So acknowledging their contribution in the very community daily lives and also the political aspects of decision making. So this whole diversity of women in indigenous actions engage or also involves heritage. As I said before, the heritage is our essence that makes us indigenous. This cultural heritage is our essence, is our identity. So that's why I told you to please observe that 43% is outside the traditional land. Like myself, today I'm in the city to be able to have good internet access. Nonetheless, I don't feel less indigenous, less connection. So when we reflect on heritage in the Brazilian context, take into account this diversity that I mentioned, the diversity of peoples and diversity also of situations as human indigenous, is to bring in the essence. Still I have time?
Você tem mais pouco de tempo.
Ah, tá bom. É porque quando começa a falar, às vezes eu não paro.
Yes, because sometimes when I start speaking, I don't stop. Thank you. So bringing in this issue of diversity and also the very relation with indigenous heritage, this dialogue that from my point of view is not a
Hierarquia, mas é padrão que precisa estar.
But a pattern that must be leveled. Our indigenous heritage, who are we, connected to the essence of our history, the essence of our culture, the essence of our ancestors in the territory, as well as this cultural heritage that it is outside our land, occupying the decision-making spaces, disputing those spaces in other means, not only the community realm.
as potencialidades e a
As I
capacidade.
said, there is a need to acknowledge the potentialities and the competencies of this diversity of women indigenous in the decision-making process. Because from my point of view, the decision-making is not only an outside, external political realm, but it is also an internal decision-making in our communities. So there are some communities that are had acknowledged the importance of the indigenous women in the very dialogue of the community, but sometimes they had suffered external influences, minimizing the ability, the knowledge of such women. And here I propose a reflection. Is this a heritage? It is not. As I said, heritage cannot be a hierarchical issue. It must be equalitarian between opportunities, equality of opportunity and equity. Because speaking about the diversity of indigenous peoples, in the way that myself, Xavante, and talking regarding the diversity of indigenous women will be different than the other 333 peoples that exist in Brazil. I believe that's it for now.
Thank you. Obrigada, Tsitsina. Shahid?
Shahid, you're muted.
You're muted.
This is the third time in a row. Thank you, Tsitsina. I really appreciate your reflection on the expansion of women's voices since the new constitution was introduced after the dictatorship, and how women have been able to raise their voices and be heard. But that at the same time, this should not prevent reflection on what has been achieved and what has not been achieved. And that indeed, the question of hierarchy, equity, and being equal still remains at issues. What struck me during your speech is the great value you placed on place, and that heritage, place, and the participation of women is important as much as the equation of heritage with culture, and that there shouldn't be a distinction between what is formally defined as heritage and what Indigenous people define as culture. With that, I would like to open up the discussion now for others to ask questions and to make comments. While people are thinking about the type of questions that they might want to ask, perhaps I could ask of each of the speakers this question, which is you've all presented in one form or another the relationship between the formal and the informal, and I wonder if there's any reflection on the outcomes of the particular events and or issues that you've been raising. So, for example, what has been the impact of the disaster relief and its intersection with the more informal aspects in Indonesia, in Aceh in particular, particularly since where women are much more concerned with the household and the agricultural aspects, which does not leave them much spare time. I wonder if the more formal concerns that there be participation of women have had any impact on their what might be called traditional culture. And this would be the same in the case of Nigeria and in Brazil. What has been some of the impacts or the outcomes of what may be seen as a more formal but outside influence on localized heritage and culture?
Shall I give it a start? And because I think the first question was kind of referred to me, but I want to say first and foremost that I really enjoyed the presentation of the other two speakers, both of Toki and Tsitsina, and I really liked the way, without knowing each other, there was a kind of intersectionality of flow.
Yes,
and that's amazing. And I just want to say that because as a matter of fact, being also a spectator of the other two, that I really enjoy that. And I think I can relate on both the presentation, answering to your question. I think what was peculiar for Indonesia, because I'm not considering the world country, I'm focusing on a very specific, also for Indonesia, when as a European, you say I've been to Aceh, they will look at you like an alien. And then if you add, as a gay man researcher, I've been to Aceh, they were like, okay, you haven't been stoned. I mean, of course, I'm not exaggerating here, but what I mean is that there is a strong, I think in this debate on heritage, we need to take into account what I was trying to make as a point, the individual and the collective component. And that is also overcharged, because as a European entering in doing field work on tsunami affected and conflict affected area, I have my own heritage, which doesn't belong to me, but I have the own heritage of colonialism in a country, in a region that has been fighting against the Dutch colonialism and then against the central power of the Javanese government, which stamped my visa to enter Aceh. And that was already a conflict of heritages. And of course, then you, as a Catholic on paper, at least, you enter into a Muslim community that is fasting, because that was the case when I was there. So you see that the intersectionality that I've been presenting on paper has been an intersectionality actually happening live, which echoes so much on what Tsitsina was saying about place. As an indigenous, not just in a rural area or in a forest, we are everywhere. And as a woman, we also, she said, we are everywhere in different occupations. So I think we should really go beyond this niche and this, as Toki said, outstanding heritage. There is nothing outstanding in any of the things I've been presenting, but still, I think there is a need to consider, as Tsitsina said, on a horizontal layer, the different, I would say, layers of heritage and the different interaction, because intersectionality that does not only go in terms of personal characteristic of being your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, your disability. There is an intersectionality of heritage between what is built, what is taken as your own background, although you might actually refuse and criticize that background, and how all these interact with the visiting heritage once you enter as a donor, as a researcher, or as a just simply debater or a person that is interacting with something which is outside. So there is an inner and outside space, which is both individual and collective, which I think we should actually consider more in depth. Thanks.
Thank you. Toki, do you have any response?
Yes, it was amazing to listen to Ugo's presentation and to Tsitsina's presentation as well. You could just see some of the similarities between all three, and I was like, oh wow, it's like we had a meeting, right? But again, drawing from the questions that you have raised, yes, there is an issue of hierarchy. No matter anywhere we go, there is hierarchy. And then getting accessibility, and which is why I also said, if we find ourselves at the table, are we making sure that we individually are gate openers? are we noticing that one of us is missing? So within the heritage sector, are we checking to see that everything that we have touched upon as a marginalized community, are they being represented? Are their voices being heard? And then we take it from there. Because when we look at all the conventions and we read from the perspective they're all coming from with the conventions, then you look at what's going on the ground. It's completely a disconnect, a complete disconnect. And then you begin to wonder, okay, how do we make this work practically on the ground? It's not going to, because we're coming to talk down on centuries of some sort of custodianship that has been going on based on gender roles. So usually we say we have a dual sex system going on, especially from West Africa. So the women work on the economical aspects of things and the men work on the decision-making of things. And they're quite comfortable with that, right? So the women are in the marketplaces, they're dealing with agriculture, they're taking that to the marketplace, they're selling that, and they're coming home to provide for the family. They were comfortable with that. And then the men were doing the decision making. And let us not forget that there were female chiefs as well, who did the checks and balances even within the political arena. And this is where we have the dual sex system within the African perspective, which now have relegated women because of colonization to the background where their role in traditional society is no longer recognized. And now they're fighting to self-organize and revive their guild systems, because they had guild systems that went into the political realm, that went into the economic realm, which they were the ones handling, and also dealing with the arts and crafts of that area. And so we have women coming back again. Let's go look at the Aba riots, which the British colonizers called the women's riots in Nigeria, right? Because they were fighting against taxation at that time. And so there were systems in place. The only problem we have now is accessibility to the international scene, right? Because now that accessibility needs to be mirrored, because we can't keep sending international, sorry, Ugo, I'm just going to say this, international, because technically I'm one as well, because I'm in the diaspora and I feel that way as well. Going into the African domain and telling them this is what we have theorized and this is what we think you should do based on the fact that I'm giving you money to do something you have naturally been doing. And there is a problem with that. There is a problem with that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. I was just, there are some questions that have been posed, and I was just wondering whether Tsitsina wants to answer the first set of questions, and then we can pose those other questions.
Só vou fazer comentário.
I just want to make a quick comment that I agree with both perceptions, both by Hugo and Toki, that diversity is important, but despite the diversities, we find similar situations. It's impressive. This means living in society. And so, Shahid, I believe that one of the impacts that the heritage caused on us as indigenous populations is exactly in the reflection that Hugo had just said. Heritage, as if it was European heritage, and in case of Brazil, I would say colonial heritage, because it wasn't just Europe. Europe also has a diversity, but in case of Brazil, it was the colonial heritage that are exactly what was inherited from colonization, that when arrived in Brazil had generated a series of impacts remember that in my speech I said that as a chief women that has always contributed to the very life of the community, the subsistence of the community. And it's not just that image, the stereotype that we have of women, the women at home, the mother that takes care, but also the women of the community itself that knows about traditional medicine, that knows about the way of how to express the traditional language, the women of painting. So this is the very heritage, cultural indigenous heritage. But once there was this colonial impact, they impacted indirectly some communities of indigenous peoples in Brazil. There are some communities that are matriarchal, and there are indigenous communities that are patriarchal, and there are indigenous communities, yes, matriarchal. And when there was this historical process of decolonization, bringing in this heritage or other external influences in the Brazilian history, and I believe not only in Africa, probably that must have happened the same way in Nigeria. When colonization arrived, they arrived asking, who is the chief? Who is the man of this community? With which man shall I speak to? So they already arrived bringing their values, their heritage. This had influence directly in series of cultural processes. And that's why I say that culture is dynamics. It changes. Something changes for the better and others went backwards. So since there was women and still exist in community spaces, there was a negationism. They said, no, that's not the point. They denied that. And sometimes it wasn't even the men that had the decision making. So they impacted a lot such processes of heritages in the indigenous land. The intersectionality, yes.
Yes. Thank you. I just before we run out of time, I do want to raise. There are two questions that have been posed. This one is from Rim, who asked, if women are presumed to share the same male's opinions, how can they be consulted or involved without imposing other external standards on them? Perhaps we can start. We can go through the same process again. If we start with Hugo and follow the same.
I think that was we were asked this question, but thanks to you very much, because that was in line with what Tsitsina just said now. I think, and this was one my line of results, the assumption that asking also women, as if also imply that you are being so inclusive, but this should be the minimum, the bare minimum, because you're including men and women and should including everyone in order not to leave anyone behind in the heritage debate. But I think that question, the way it is written, is very good, because it says, without imposing other external standards. If you read what the article was mentioning on the sustainable reconstruction, the criticism I did about it, is actually external standards were imposed by all these organizations that were labeling their program gender sensitive, because as Sina just said, now the first debater entering in the village was believed to be the head of the village, the male, and without actually knowing that, for instance, in Aceh, being matriarchal and uxorical, actually there was a female leader that was in charge also of redistributing houses to widowers that were not actually considered at all by any other organization. Another example, when asking how to divide the space of the reconstructed houses, the traditional houses, there was this imposition that the kitchen should be at the front door because for the light, completely misleading what was the main women conception of the space, that actually kitchen should be at the backward, close to the yard, where other women will share the cooking experience as intangible heritage. And last, as a key example, is all this rhetoric about gender-sensitive school for, I will not mention the organization, but a big international donor on gender-sensitive school, and it was all about bathroom for women, for girls and boys, and then actually those bathrooms were just used as utility rooms because there was no water connection. So I think, you know, the key issue here is really about exactly what Toki said before. How do we translate, and that's why I call it sense-making about the informal institution. How do we translate this big concept that we keep writing on international declaration, the 2030 agenda, the SDGs devoted to gender equity, the Sendai framework, you name it. I mean, until now, everything has had the label recently gender sensitive action. But what is gender first? Can we embrace different conception of gender beyond also what is nowadays in Western gender studies, also, for instance, including indigenous voices and marginalized voices at the core, and then also asking, when you go concretely into action, what does imply gender sensitive? What is actually the sensitivity that you're touching? Because I'm sure you will be touching lots of sensitivities.
It might be the case that if women are distributing their houses, if you want to be gender sensitive, you might want to have a male involved in the distribution of
but also it's a bit of this is another debate that I keep having, like who are you as a man to speak about gender sensitive? I'm like, but this is so old-fashioned. Exactly. Do I have to wear, do I have to dress up as a woman to raise some issues that actually embrace the philosophy of gender, which is beyond this binary logic? Because I still have, even in wherever I go, this kind of criticism, you should not be allowed to talk about this issue. You're not even a woman, you cannot understand it. So that is also something that is very cultural in terms of heritage.
Toki, I see you nodding your head furiously there.
Yeah,
please.
Because I think we get burnt out with categorization, right? So when we start with categorization, we want to fit everybody into a box and they need to be doing certain things, which is why I keep saying social responsibility has nothing to do with that specification. It means we're responsible for one another, regardless of what the individual is or are, really? And then going beyond that, we need to go beyond these boxes and be responsible, that ethically responsible, that, okay, this is what we're addressing. Is everyone at the table? It shouldn't have to be what is our color, blue, pink. It shouldn't have to be. It has to be about the issue. Is what we're addressing relevant in this area? And how does it affect the people there? And what are they saying about it? Are they at the table? Are they talking about their challenges? Are they getting accessibility? I think it's going beyond all of these categorizations that keeps us. It's the same thing with, because I just get really frustrated when I hear nature, rural. To me, heritage, one and the same. Why do we need to separate what? You can't have one without the other. And so why do we categorize and put in boxes? Why do we stretch that? Because what is really happening in one region, what is affecting one region may not necessarily be the issue another region is facing of their challenges. And maybe we need to look at that as opposed to, fine, we're going to make this intangible and we're going to make this tangible. Okay.
It might have to do with the way in which Tsitsina has expressed it. Who comes into the village or town or city or wherever you are meeting, and what is the first question they ask? take me
Yes.
to your leader.
I
And
know,
then,
right?
and make the assumption that the leader is the man. And so that requires that whoever that expert is, whether it's the colonial district officer or whether the expert from the World Heritage Center, has to be, they in fact have to be sensitized as to what is the appropriate way of approaching this, rather than just come there with a policy document which says, I have to be gender sensitive, and you understand it in a particular way. Tsitsina, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something. Why not take me to the community and let the community decide?
Well, they might say, take me to the community, and then ask who's the leader.
The leader will naturally just come out. Okay, I'm done.
Tsitsina, would you want to have a response to that question? Around who should...
Então, Shahid, eu acabei de me confundir, que eu estou acompanhando pelo chat, porque eu não falo inglês. Então, assim, eu agradeço quem está traduzindo, mas é porque...
I got mistaken. I was listening. I just wanted to clarify the question. I want to thank the translator. And what question are you saying? The idea of thought, assuming that the women has the same kind of thought as men, or the question regarding the convention of both?
No. You can answer both, but the question was really about, do men share the same opinions as women? Or do we presume that that is the case?
Tá. Então, a primeira pergunta.
So the first question, the issue is that the assumptions. I want to say that we have a great diversity in Brazil. I'm going to talk about my reality. Our society, Xavante people, is a patriarchal community. So I am Xavante because my father was Xavante. So my mother is not indigenous, my father is. So we have this lineage from the man. And my father has had two wives. One was Xavante and one was non-indigenous, and had children with both. I am the youngest of 11 children. Out of all these children, we had the same opportunity of studying, education, schooling in the city, not at home, traditional education, schooling outside, to read, to write, have a profession. We had the same opportunities. My sisters, my older sisters that are from my father's first marriage with the Xavante women, at some point in her youth, they decided to go back to the village and have their families. My brothers, the same thing. When I arrived in my youth, about 15 years old, I told my father, I want to have a boyfriend. And he said, no, you can't have a boyfriend, you have to study. And I said, but father, all my sisters have had boyfriends, why can't I? And then he said, I'm going to hold you a little bit longer. And I kept thinking why he was saying that. I couldn't understand at that time with 15 years old, but now I can understand. Out of all my siblings, we had the same opportunity. I was the only one, and I hope that other comes. I hope I can say that I am the first of others. I hope my siblings are alive. I hope they continue to move forward in this educational external process, because I see it as important. But it came a point when I understood that, and now I am 35 years old. I am not married. I have no children. This goes between quote unquote against the structure of the Xavante's social structure. how how come a woman with 35 years old without having had birth a child and haven't got married? There is pressure from this indigenous society and outside also the external society. Why haven't you get married? Society always imposes that. You know, and not only men, women also imposes onto us that seems that we have to follow a cycle of life. But what's this cycle that I cannot decide what I do with my body? And then when criticism is internal within my people, since why haven't to get married, I tell them, thanks to my father, a man, I had opportunity to follow other pathways. So thanks to a man, see, I had other opportunities for reflection. So not necessarily men and women think the same. Maybe there's a need for us women to have opportunity to produce other thoughts and produce other paths. Hugo commented, "You, why are you going to speak? You're not a woman. You can't say." But why? But in Brazil, he's not is a non-indigenous man. But what about here in Brazil? Sometimes some communities culture changes, as I said, but the social structure in the decision-making realm, usually it's just the man. But this does not mean that in the realm of women or at their in front door, this man speaks with their wives or their child, their daughters. They are not visible in the decision-making process, but they have been heard. This I see taking place in my people, Xavante. Currently, there are women Xavante, a few, but they participate in the space of voice, which is visible to others. But what I think is needed is opportunity. Maybe my father, with his line of thought, I'm going to hold you back for you to work, for you to study, for you to get to know other things. If I hadn't had that opportunity, I probably would be like, maybe I could have been like my sisters. Not that this is bad, this is also important. All competencies in our diversities of women indigenous must be acknowledged. All capacities and all potentials, regardless if it is community related or in the city. We have competencies, we are able, and all this must be acknowledged and valued. And but at the same time, we must have the opportunity to dream, to be able to achieve what we want to be. Uh, so that's I think what it's all about. Opportunity, have opportunity.
Thank you, Tsitsina. I want to just pose the second question, if I can just find it quickly. There we are. Before, because we're beginning to run out of time, and I do want to put this question. This is from Mirelli. I hope I've pronounced it correctly. Don't you think that the awareness of the outstanding influence, the hierarchical conception of heritage, is partly a result of the influence of the 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage? So, so then the question goes on. As a matter of fact, the latter convention refuses to consider listed heritage as superior to other forms of heritage. So if I could put this question to the three panelists, and could we start with the same process that we had, Hugo, and then the others to follow?
I think I'm not sure what exactly the second part of the question means. I don't know if we have. How do you read it? Because
if I could
grasp it in a way that it makes sense.
Yeah, I think the question is if I understand it correctly, we had the Venice convention which talks about outstanding cultural influences, or what is an outstanding cultural artifact, building, and it was really a material aspect, something that was materialized. The 2003 convention, which is the intangible convention, partly through the NARA document, challenges this idea of materiality being the only thing that could be outstanding. And outstanding almost implies a hierarchy, that there are some things that are outstanding and there are others that are not. Whereas the intangible heritage challenges this idea. So
I think, yeah.
So the question would be, how do we deal with this almost like contradictoriness between the two conventions?
I mean, the reason why I also want to say that I love the Toki's comment about, I mean, and I take it also as a future presentation, but I was still talking about tangible and intangible. And the reason why I actually was kind of feeling obliged as an economist to use those categories was indeed because of these two conventions. It looks like if you talk about heritage and you don't make this distinction, you will be crucified, because actually you haven't done your homework, basically.
Yeah.
And so to answer the question, I think that there is a literally contradiction between the outstanding and the marginalized voices. Outstanding would never mainstream marginalized voices, because there is a simple reason why they are marginalized, and it was Foucault called the micro power of who decide what and who gets what. And who decide what? It's not just about, I dislike you because you are disabled and gay, and there was a question on that. As a government, we will still all exist with our differences. I mean, the fact that there is racism in society that didn't allow actually movement to come and make the voice heard. I think what is interesting here is what kind of analytical frameworks will we be using from now on in order to make the marginalized not marginalized, or even, as it was said also by Tsitsina, how do we make, I mean, we need to be really allies of each other. We really need to go this cross-fertilization of backgrounds, of heritages that we have as individuals, and that we build collectively into the different categories that you mentioned in the introduction, the LGBTI, the disabled. I mean, of course, we need that kind of box because we feel comfortable in it. But the more you grow up and the more you grow older, for instance, there's a friend of mine that keeps saying we are all one accident away from becoming disabled. So the fact that today you are actually fit doesn't mean that tomorrow you go in the street, you fall down, and God knows what happened. So I think this kind of normal language that we all have from our daily life should contaminate a bit more the logic. And I love, there is one of my anthropologists' favorite anthropologists, Jean-Luc Ancel, in French, he would call about the logique métisse, this cross-fertilization of identities that, he was using it as a criticism of the colonial past in French when dividing the different logic in Africa, when there was not different logic, it was the European way of looking at those logic. Well, I think this should be something that we need to do also theoretically, like while not focusing only on the outstanding, because of course we need the outstanding heritage. I mean, I'm Italian, there are so many outstanding things that, I come from, there is Venice, there is Rome, but how many actually history of marginalization have been actually persuaded in those empires up to now, up to modern Italy, for instance. So I guess that outstanding, it's really something that we need to also be able to criticize without deconstructing the beauty of it, but by embracing the marginalization process that is also embedding in it.
Thank you. I wonder if Toki or Tsitsina want to have any comments on that question, because I see Ariella has made pose another question about whether, because in the framework of UNESCO dealing with heritage, tangible, intangible is embedded in it, and you have to address that. You will not be able to list a heritage site in any form without addressing it in those very clear, unambiguous terms that they do. But so you can't ignore it, but how can you overcome it or go around it? Is that a way in which to do that? And the only people that can do this when they're making these representations are state parties or the governments of the day. Do the governments of the day buy into the conventions, or do they want to approach this in a way which represents their people's voices rather than the voices of the convention? Anybody?
Well, maybe we need a new convention.
True. It's one of the reasons why we are having a conference in September.
Yeah. Maybe we need a new convention that addresses all of that and gets everybody on the table talking at the same time. Because the reason why we have these two different conventions is because certain people were excluded from that convention. And that's why we have all these conventions we have in the first place. So maybe we need a new one with everybody at the table, tentatively speaking about how these properties get listed, why they're getting listed, what are the criteria based on the people that still currently maintain the sites, and then we turn it to our universal value. So there's no hierarchy, in what should be listed, because they're all clamoring to look for something that looks more Eurocentric as opposed to their own traditional heritage. Because right now in Africa, we have a lot of Western looking buildings. Nobody wants to work with earth because it doesn't look like the West. And so people are moving away because they say, oh, it's primitive. We don't want that. We need to go with the time. But then you're losing your connection to source because they're trying to adapt to what is out there. And that is a problem, because now we can't even find a lot of the earth buildings because they're tearing them down.
Yeah. I have opinions on those, but I would hope that people.
I know you do.
I support the idea you're pushing. I wonder if others, anybody on the outside of the panel might want to comment, would perfectly happy to do so. They can put that into the chat. But Tsitsina, would you want to say anything along about these conventions that put us into kind of straitjackets, and you have to do one or the other or both, but separately?
Sim, eu vou fazer comentário. Bem, eu acredito que, como você mesmo
Yes,
disse,
I want to make a consideration. As you said, Shahid, even though we separate in little boxes, how can we go beyond? I believe that this is the issue, how to go beyond. So in the same way that culture is dynamics, time is also dynamic. So maybe a public policy, for example, let's think locally. A local public policy in Brazil, when created, it was created based on a request, based on a situation, as a response. But then will come a time when it needs to be reevaluated. Is that public policies that were created 15 years ago still meets the social needs, economical and cultural needs of current times in society? And in this sense, taking the example in the local level, national level, that I'm speaking in Brazil, now we are under an administration that's really adverse, that had taken away our rights of manifestation. We are not living in a democracy in Brazil no more. But until then, there was, from time to time, every 2 years, conferences regarding health, conference for education, environmental conferences, so that this moment, during these conferences, we make sure the civil society and also organizational, both government and non-government organizations could evaluate the public policies if they were taking place or not. So both in the local level as a country, I see a need also internationally to have this sort of evaluations. The regulatory benchmarks in the international levels are very important from my point of view. So I think that this is, again, one tool and one instrument that civil society has to denounce, for example, in the international courts. If the benchmarks is not contemplating the reality, I believe that we must move on to a time for evaluations, because society also change and the historical aspect some remains, but there is a scholar from Portugal. He used to say, his name is Robert Castelo. He says that those are history problematized facts. Facts continue during some periods of time in history, but then society changes, economy changes, and culture changes. So there's a need to have this period for evaluation so that society as a whole and civil society in its diversity in fact is heard, and that these international and national benchmarks can in fact meet the real requests, the real demands.
Thank you, Tsitsina. I think I don't see any new questions in the chat itself. So perhaps we've come to a point where the issues raised are now one for where we want to reflect, rather than one where all the answers are now given. I think one answer we have is that, yes, these conventions are now ready for a reevaluation and a revamping. I think that is very clear from the discussions that we've had today. But that we need to reflect much more, particularly at what constitutes the right approach within a local level. This is not at all clear from reading the more formal aspects of conventions, of policies, of legislation, and that this needs a serious discussion, a serious reflection on where do we go from here. I want to thank every single one of the panelists. All have brought a slight sense of humor and seriousness to the discussion, which makes it for a much better kind of discussion than one which is terribly serious, and that then the discussion becomes very stilted and very argumentative. I think we've had a nice open discussion. People have participated. Some really serious searching questions have been asked, and people have responded extremely well, and in particular the panelists. I've absolutely enjoyed the responses that you've had. So thank you all for this. And unless there are any last responses that the panelists want to make, I want to bring this particular session to an end.
I just want to add and to congratulate our panelists and also thank them very much for this wonderful and very powerful session and the very insightful thoughts that they share with us. So thank you very much for the great session. And thank you, Shahid. And thank you, Shahid, for moderating this session. And thank you also to the rapporteurs, to Ruba, that are helping us today. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very
and
much.
let me say thank you to Monica and her team. They've been doing this for quite a few months now, and it's really marvelous what you've been doing. Thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you
Sorry,
very much.
sorry, you'll go.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.